Hope everyone enjoyed their lunch and a good little walkabout. Our next talk will be by Matthew Skic, who serves as the Curator of Exhibitions at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. It's a great title, by the way. Curator of Exhibitions. I like that one. Yeah. Originally from New Jersey, Matthew studied history at American University in Washington, D.C. Welcome back. Yeah. He joined the curatorial staff at the Museum of the American Revolution in June 2016, soon after graduating from the Winterthur Program in American Material Culture at the University of Delaware. Since the museum's opening in 2017, Matthew has curated multiple award-winning exhibitions, including The Cost of Revolution, The Life and Death of an Irish Soldier, and has helped to expand the museum's online educational resources. He recently served as the lead curator of the 2023 special exhibit, Black Founders, the Forten Family of Philadelphia, which is the inspiration for his talk today, Picturing the Fortens, Portraits of a Free Black Family in Philadelphia. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you very much, Will. Thank you, everyone, for being here in person and online. Can everybody hear me all right? Yes? Okay, great. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to share this story that I have been working on researching and preparing for an exhibit that we opened in February of 2023 that Will mentioned, Black Founders, the Forten Family of Philadelphia. And today I am going to focus on depictions of the Forten family, both painted portraits and photographic, and also highlight some painted portraits that a member of the family commissioned. And so we'll go through that journey. But just to give you some background, the Black Founders exhibit at the Museum of the American Revolution shares the story of James Forten and his family. Now, James Forten was born in Philadelphia in 1766. He was born free and grew up as a member of the growing free African-American community in the city and grew up in the age of the American Revolution. At the age of 9, he was there for the first public reading of the Declaration of Independence on July 8, 1776. At the age of 14 in 1781, he signed up for service aboard a revolutionary privateer ship that operated out of Philadelphia. That ship was called the Royal Louis or Royal Louis. And later that year, now 15 years old, James Forten became a prisoner of war of the British, spent 7 months aboard a British prison ship called the Jersey, and survived that experience, came back to Philadelphia, became an apprenticed sailmaker, a trade that his father had worked in, but his father had died in about 1773. And he was now working for his father's former employer, who employed an integrated workforce, a white sailmaker named Robert Bridges, employing an integrated workforce. Forten rose up in the ranks of that business, so much so that Robert Bridges decided to actually give the business to James Forten. And now Forten is leading that integrated workforce and becomes a Black business leader in the city of Philadelphia. And he leads that business from 1798 until his death in 1842, rising to become the wealthiest African-American person in Philadelphia and perhaps the entire United States in the early 19th century. But the exhibit doesn't just stop at James Forten, but actually expands to his wife, Charlotte Vandine Forten, their children. They had 9 children together, 8 of whom survived to adulthood, and goes even to the generation of their grandchildren to share 3 generations of one family story of living in Philadelphia and encouraging the nation to further commit to its founding ideals of liberty, equality, and self-government. The Forten family is active in abolitionist circles, leading anti-slavery organizations. They are very much civil rights activists in the early 19th century. And so in the exhibit, you learn about the revolutionary story of James Forten. We commissioned a scale model of the ship that he served aboard. We bring together documents documenting his military service. We talk about the free Black community in Philadelphia in the early 19th century. We made really wonderful connections with living descendants of the Forten family that are now spread throughout the country. And those descendants have put on loan some key artifacts, objects that have been passed down through 6, 7 generations of the family and have never been publicly displayed before, never been studied by scholars before, but they're on display in the exhibit, including this table that belonged to James Forten that is currently owned by a step descendant of James Forten he lives out in Arizona. This is the first time it's ever been publicly displayed, along with samplers, needlework samplers that James Forten's daughters stitched in 1817 and 1822. We talk about the family's role after James Forten's lifetime in the Civil War period, in which one of James Forten's sons serves in the 43rd Regiment of United States Colored Troops during the Civil War, and the family's multifaceted support of the United States effort during the Civil War. And this builds upon decades of scholarship, but also is adding new contributions to the story of the Forten family. And the Fortens, they've been subjects of various scholarship by historians like Erica Armstrong Dunbar. The first scholarly biography of James Forten came out in 2003, written by Julie Winch. Gary Nash has written about the Forten family. But the Fortens are still not a name that's well known outside of Philadelphia. Just by a show of hands, have any of you heard of the Fortens before today? Right, it's not really. They're not a very well known name, although they were right there with William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott in reform efforts of the 19th century. And we'll talk a little bit more about this this afternoon. And we'll talk about that through portraiture. But first, just to give you a sense of family tree, I know we're at the DAR Museum. Genealogy is pretty important here. So let's just give you a lay of the land. James Forten marries a woman named Martha Beatty. She dies very soon after their marriage. And he remarries a much younger woman. She's about 20 years younger than him, Charlotte Vandine, another free woman of African descent in Philadelphia. They have 9 children together, 8 of whom survive to adulthood. Now, there is a photographic portrait of Charlotte Vandine Forten, only one known. There is a portrait of James Forten, but of their 9 children, there's only one known portrait of those children that is at least known to survive. There might be one out there we just don't know about, but only one. We'll talk about that a little later. But 4 of the children, the Forten children, have children of their own. So only half of those children carry on the family line. The rest, one dies very young, others don't marry. But here are the 22 grandchildren in the purple boxes, descended from the 4 children that have children of their own. So 22 grandchildren of James and Charlotte Forten. And we'll be focusing on throughout this presentation where you see the red stars. Those are the photographic and painted portraits we have of those members. So that's what we'll be focusing on today. But first, let's start with James Forten. So that painted portrait I showed on screen earlier is this one here. This is the full view of it, uncropped. It's a gouache portrait on paper. It's in the collection of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And this portrait dates to the 1820s, 1830s, which corresponds with the height of James Forten's career as a quite successful sailmaker in Philadelphia. The sails that he is making and the workmen that he's employing, about 30 men that he's employing, those sails are the power behind merchant vessels that are sailing out of the port of Philadelphia, other ship owners beyond the Philadelphia region when they're coming into Philadelphia's port. They're having their sails repaired by James Forten. He's very much the leading sailmaker in Philadelphia at the time. And so this portrait, though, is not 100% known to be James Forten. It is very, very likely that it is James Forten, but the Historical Society of Pennsylvania acquired this portrait, added it to its collection in the early 1930s, and it was given to them as part of a large group of records of the American Negro Historical Society, which was established by a Black antiquarian named Leon Gardner. And so if you go to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania to do research, you'll encounter the Leon Gardner collection there. Documents, printed portraits, and this is one of the few painted portraits that's part of this collection. And however, the records of this portrait and its file at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania is essentially empty. There's no other information that came along with it, but it has been identified as early as the 1930s as James Forten, partly because of his prominence in Philadelphia, in which this portrait, based on his clothing style, that this dates to. But it's very likely that it's him. We're not 100% sure that it is indeed him. But because of its Philadelphia provenance, because of its connection to showing a gentleman of African descent connected to Philadelphia, very likely it is him. And if you think about the creation of this portrait, it's a profile. It's pretty detailed, but it's also quite small. It's only about 8 inches tall, just to give you a sense of it. And it may have been created with the aid of a physiognotrace. And because of that really kind of precise profile that you see in the portrait. And one of the interesting things about it, that blue star is marking Lombard Street. The blue star is where James Forten's home was, the home that he purchased in 1805, soon after his marriage to Charlotte Vandine Forten. It was a 3-story brick townhome, and it was a block away from where the Peel family lived. Peel family of artists. One of their homes was on Lombard Street. And so is it possible that this is a member of the Peel family that is creating this? They're known, a family that's known to have been using physiognotrace, known to have been creating profile portraits like this one. Did Moses Williams have something to do with the creation of this and his cutting of silhouettes alongside the Peel family? Moses Williams being enslaved by the Peel family and working on contributing to the art that family is producing. All possibilities, I think. But what this portrait stands in contrast to is other depictions of people of African descent in Philadelphia that are being published in the city at the same time. So this is just one of a number of caricatures that were serialized in Philadelphia and then later reprinted in London, part of a series done by artist Edward Clay. This was a series called Life in Philadelphia, and it was caricaturing and emphasizing racial stereotypes and prejudice towards the free Black elite in the city of Philadelphia. It wasn't calling out people by name, but who was this targeting? The Forten family and their contemporaries, such as the Bustalls, the Douglas family, the Whipper family. These are members of the Black elite in Philadelphia. These are business owners, men and women who are doors are continually being closed to them in terms of educational opportunities. They are facing racial prejudice on a daily basis in the city of Philadelphia. And then a white artist, Edward Clay, and his wildly popular and financially successful Life in Philadelphia series is poking fun at this rising group of Black elites, which the Forten family is a part of. But it's also similar to other painted portraits. The portrait of James Forten is part of a small group of known portraits of free Black Philadelphians, that Black elite that is a bit more respectful, quite a bit more respectful, and actually noting their prominence, noting their financial success, their social success. This is a portrait of a contemporary of James Forten, who's a little younger than him, but William Whipper here on screen really looked up to James Forten, and together they formed an organization called the American Moral Reform Society in the 1840s. This portrait of William Whipper dates to the 1840s, part of the collection at the Fenimore Museum of Art in Cooperstown. So very respectful portrait by William Matthew Pryor of William Whipper here. Really wonderful, stands in similarity to James Forten's portrait. Others include the Montiers, the Montier family. This is these portraits have been recently on loan to the Philadelphia Museum of Art from the direct descendants of the Montiers. Hiram Montier and his wife Elizabeth, portraits painted around the time of their marriage. Hiram Montier was a bootmaker in Philadelphia, but also part of the Black elite in the city. So this portrait of James Forten, while it has some questions surrounding it, it's unsigned. There's no date on it. Is it actually James Forten? There's some questions around it, but as far as we know, it's very likely him. But other portraits of the family were a lot more sure about. But I want to, before we move on to that, I wanted to point out this quote, and an intriguing quote from James Forten's son-in-law, Robert Purvis, who we're going to hear a little bit more about later. This is writing, Purvis is writing in the 1880s. He's actually writing to William Lloyd Garrison Jr., who's working on who at the time was working on a biography of his father, the noted New England abolitionist, who was a friend of the Forten families. And William Lloyd Garrison Jr. was asking if there was a portrait of James Forten that he can include in this printed biography of his father. And Robert Purvis writes that, in my judgment, I believe you can paint with your pen a more satisfactory likeness of that excellent man, referring to James Forten, than you may get from the very poor one Mrs. Forten has. So it's suggesting that Mrs. Forten, Charlotte Vandine Forten, who outlived her husband by well over 40 years, still owned a portrait of her husband and displayed it in the Forten family home on Lombard Street into the 1880s. She passed away in 1884 at the just shy of her 100th birthday. And speaking of Charlotte Vandine Forten, let's take a look at her portrait. This is a photographic portrait. And this photograph of Charlotte Vandine Forten, the only one of her known to survive, has been here in Washington, D.C. since the early 1900s, because it's part of the collection at Howard University at the Moreland Spingarn Research Center, part of the Francis and Charlotte Grimke papers. Hear a little bit more about them shortly. But this portrait was done, photograph was taken of her in the 1860s. We know who the photographer was. On the back, you can see this is a photograph. She was photographed by Isaac Wren and Sons, a prominent Philadelphia photographer, at their studio on Arch Street. And this is showing Charlotte Vandine Forten in her elder years. Her husband had passed away in 1842. She never remarried. She lived until 1884. And she lived at the Forten family home with her daughter, Margaretta Forten, who is a noted female Black educator in the city. And Charlotte Vandine Forten was well respected in the circles of reform and abolition in the years leading to the Civil War. And then her daughters, her grandchildren, are becoming more and more involved in the women's suffrage movement in the late 19th century. But really amazing photograph of her depicting her towards the end of her life. And one of the things I'll point out a little bit later is the physical spaces, keeping in mind the physical spaces that these family members are going to have their portraits done. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is another Isaac Wren and Son photograph. This one's in the National Gallery of Arts collection. The Wrens are photographing other Black Philadelphians. This is an unnamed, we don't know the name of this gentleman here, young gentleman here, but the Wrens are photographing other Black Philadelphians in this period. They're the only child of James and Charlotte Forten to have a photograph that we know about is their one of their older daughters, Harriet Davy Forten, who was born in 1810. And the only reason we know about it is because it was reprinted in the a biography of Susan B. Anthony that was published in the 1870s. And this portrait of Harriet Davy Forten Purvis, she had married Robert Purvis, the gentleman I had mentioned earlier with that quote about the Forten portrait. So Harriet Purvis was pretty active in abolitionist circles, along with her mother, her sisters, and Lucretia Mott. They helped to establish one of the earliest integrated female-run anti-slavery societies, the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, which was established in 1833. Harriet was an active member, frequently served as an officer of that society for her in her 20s and 30s. And she and her husband, Robert, were very much an abolitionist power couple, I would say, in Philadelphia in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. They are the sort of taking the mantle from James Forten, especially after he passes, and Charlotte Vandine Forten as she's becoming more elderly. Harriet Davy Forten Purvis and Robert Purvis are very much leading the charge in Philadelphia in the free Black community to advocate for citizenship for Black Americans, an end to slavery nationwide. Because don't forget, Pennsylvania is often labeled in history books as a free state, but slavery existed in Pennsylvania until the 1840s. So realize that. This is still something that, slavery is still something that the Forten family is not only hearing about, but seeing on a daily basis. They're also participating in the Underground Railroad. They are harboring freedom seekers who are coming up from the Upper South, from different parts of Pennsylvania. They are quite active in many ways. So Harriet Davy Forten Purvis, her husband was Robert Purvis, who was born in South Carolina to he had a white father who was a merchant, and his mother was a free woman of color in Charleston, South Carolina. Robert Purvis's grandmother had been enslaved, but his mother was free, and that free status transfers to her son, Robert, in Charleston, South Carolina, when he's born in 1810. But Robert Purvis's father and his mother, they considered themselves married, but in South Carolina, they can't be legally married. They move up to Philadelphia and reestablish their lives in the city of Philadelphia. Robert Purvis and his brother Joseph and their other brother, they grow up in the city of Philadelphia and quickly befriend the Fortens. As teenagers, Robert Purvis and his brother Joseph marry two of the Forten daughters, Harriet and Harriet's sister Sarah. And this daguerreotype of Robert Purvis dates to the 1840s. It's in the Boston Public Library's collection. And shows him as a young man. He had inherited great wealth from his father, and he was a rising star in the abolitionist movement. And he was there along with his father-in-law, James Forten, for the establishment of the American Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia in 1833. He was the first Black member of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, which had ironically had barred Black membership in the society until Robert Purvis joins. He is very much a rising star, and he's one of the most photographed members of this family, as you'll see as we go through. Here he is, center of the screen there, sitting just to Lucretia Mott's right. And that's James Mott, Lucretia's husband, just to the left of her. This is the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. These are the officers of that society. Robert Purvis was one of those officers. And this photograph dates to 1851. It was, this photograph was taken in the studio of probably the most prominent photographer in Philadelphia of the mid-19th century, and that's a man of German ancestry, Frederick Guttekunst, he photographed Lincoln, Grant, William Lloyd Garrison, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony. He was the photographer in Philadelphia in the around the years of the Civil War. But here is Robert Purvis at the center of this photograph from 1851. Robert Purvis also appears in this group of tintypes of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. This grouping dates to the 1850s. Robert Purvis is on the right-hand side in the middle row there. He's just above William Still, who's considered the father of the Underground Railroad. But what Robert Purvis had done even before William Still got involved in his leadership of the Underground Railroad was help to establish the earlier iteration of the Philadelphia Vigilant Association, which was in a public view, was aiding and supporting Philadelphia's growing free Black community and in the city and in the region surrounding the city. But they had a secret subcommittee that was helping freedom seekers. And there's only one surviving record book of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, and that's specifically that secret subcommittee that survives in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania's collection. And that is a ledger book that documents the people that they helped coming up from Virginia, Maryland, South Carolina, Delaware, who are coming to Philadelphia. Robert Purvis and agents that he was working with and that were working under him were giving clothing, food, shelter, and then cash and also arranging transportation for those freedom seekers to go farther north to New York City, to Boston, to Canada. And this ledger book documents young woman, light complexion, helped by an agent, given $5, transportation arranged to Canada. That's what these ledger entries say in that book. And that's Robert Purvis is doing that work, and others like him. That organization is reinvigorated in the 1850s, and these are the leaders of that reinvigorated organization, the Vigilant Association. So here's a closer look at Robert Purvis there. Now, Robert Purvis had an interesting experience in Philadelphia. And as he traveled, he was one of the more well-traveled members of the family. When he went across the Atlantic, he went to Ireland and visited Daniel O'Connell, the great Irish patriot, who O'Connell commended Robert Purvis's abolitionist efforts in Philadelphia. One anecdote that Purvis encounters is that when he boards the ship to go across the Atlantic, there's a Southern gentleman that is with him who believes Robert Purvis to be white. He dines with him, and Robert Purvis doesn't share that he is of African descent. And when Purvis is coming back to the United States, he actually is on the same ship as that same guy and says, "Hey, I just want to let you know you're dining at the table of a man of African descent." And the guy, the gentleman, is very angered at this. He feels like he's been sort of duped and is confused. He's angry. But this is a routine thing that Robert Purvis experiences as he's traveling and living in Philadelphia. This is a little bit later portrait of Robert Purvis, really wonderful facial hair. But this is 1890. This is another Frederick Guttekunst photograph of Robert Purvis, done in 1890. This is the I'm sorry, this is not Frederick Goodham. This is a Walmsley Company photograph, part of the Massachusetts Historical Society's collection. But Walmsley and Company, another prominent Philadelphia photography company. This is the later life Frederick Goodham photograph of Robert Purvis. There's multiple versions of it that you see. There's these two here. This is Frederick Goodham himself. Had a long career as a photographer in Philadelphia. And here's the shop. This is where Robert Purvis entered these doors to have his photograph taken, as did Lincoln, as did Grant, as did William Lloyd Garrison. And so this is part of that physical space that that Purvis and actually one of his daughters, his son, would also be photographed by by Frederick Goodham. These are the doors that they're entering for these photographs. Robert Purvis is also commissioning portraits. And this is where I wanted to kind of deviate a little bit. Nathaniel Jocelyn, Connecticut artist in abolitionist circles. Josephine, you probably recognize this one here, right? Jocelyn is actually commissioned by Robert Purvis to do two portraits, and maybe more. These are the two we know about. You might have seen these before. On the right is Jocelyn's portrait of William Lloyd Garrison, done in about 1831. Garrison was someone the Forten family really admired. James Forten was one of the initial financial backers of the Liberator newspaper. Got it up and helped get William Lloyd Garrison's paper up and running. Secured subscriptions for it in Philadelphia. And Robert Purvis commissioned Jocelyn to create this portrait of Garrison. On the right, it hung in his home, in Purvis's home on Lombard Street in Philadelphia, just down the street from where James Forten and Charlotte Forten lived. He also commissioned this portrait, which also eventually hung in the Purvis home on Lombard Street. And this is the portrait of Skic, or Sankfe PA, who was one of the leaders of the Amistad Revolt in 1839. Especially made modernly famous in Steven Spielberg's movie, but back then it was a major news story in the United States in 1839 when a illegal Spanish ship has an illegal cargo of illegally captured Africans who are being transported in the Caribbean, and then Skic and others aboard the ship revolt against the crew. They are trying to guide the ship to a port, but the Spanish crew members deceive them and actually take them farther north in the Atlantic, eventually ending up near Long Island and the coast of Connecticut, and they are intercepted by revenue cutters of the United States and brought into New Haven, where the illegally enslaved men and women are put on trial. There's and a decision is trying to be made what to do about these people. Should they be returned to Africa? Should they be given back to the Spanish traders that they revolted against? John Quincy Adams this is after his presidency, is involved with the Supreme Court. And as this is all going on, there's a lot of printed depictions of Skic, including this one that given an English name, Joseph Skic, with a little Spanish influence there. But the portrait that Robert Purvis commissions is trying to kind of counteract the less respectful depictions of Skic that are being circulated throughout the United States. And he works with Jocelyn to create this one and trying to show a respectable African, at least what, this is, Robert Purvis has never been to Africa. Jocelyn has never been to Africa, but they're trying to create a more respectful, in their minds, portrait of Skic that would counteract other portraits of him that sort of showed him as a deceiver and almost a murderer. And not only are they creating this portrait just for Robert Purvis's own display at his home, but it's being turned into a mezzotint to be distributed and sold. And this is done by John Sartain, the Philadelphia engraver, and the proceeds went into the American Anti-Slavery Society. So this was a widely distributed a print of the Cinque portrait done in Philadelphia. And here's that Garrison portrait again by Jocelyn. Charlotte L. Forten. This is one of the granddaughters of James and Charlotte Vandine Forten. This is the daughter of their son, Robert Bridges Forten. Robert Bridges Forten is the one that serves in the 43rd U.S. CT. Now, Charlotte Forten is somewhat widely known today because of her journals that she kept as a young woman growing up in Philadelphia. You might have encountered it, the Journals of Charlotte Forten Grimke. That's her married name. That comes later than her actual journals, but that's what she's known as in the printed versions of her journal. But this is the actual journal, one of the actual journals that she kept, part of the Howard University collection at the Moreland Spingarn Research Center. This is a series of journals that she keeps in the 1850s and 60s, just writing about daily life and her daily experiences growing up in Philadelphia, going to school to become a teacher in Salem, Massachusetts. Also, the efforts that she's involved in helping people transition from slavery to freedom during the Civil War in Union-occupied territory in South Carolina. She actually goes down, the only African-American woman to go down to South Carolina as part of a relief effort from Philadelphia to go and teach recently freed people in Union-occupied territory and help them adjust to life and freedom. And her journal documents that experience. But her journal also documents her daily life in Philadelphia. And here's one entry from 1857. She writes that she went to go get her photograph taken at Samuel Broadbent's studio. Here's where she went. This is the building in which she entered. And what's interesting about that, she's allowed to enter Broadbent's studio. She also writes about looking at some other photographs, including a photograph of a young enslaved girl, and kind of she's thinking about that. She grew up as a free, Charlotte grew up as in freedom throughout her life, but she's thinking about what this young girl must have endured in slavery. And then, a couple days later, she goes and wants to get ice cream with her aunt, Margaretta Forten, and they're denied service in Philadelphia. And then she, a couple days later, they're denied service again at a different place. But they are able to enter Samuel Broadbent's studio for photographs. So it's a varied experience in Philadelphia for someone like Charlotte. And if you read her journal, she hates Philadelphia. She wants to be back in New England, in Salem, where she's going to school. And, she's coming on, when she's on leave from school, she's coming back to Philadelphia. She is not happy about being in the city. And she, this was July 5th, 1857, so the day after the July 4th holiday. And what does she write about July 4th, 1857? I hate this holiday, basically. That's paraphrasing. She's saying how much she laments that day coming because it's so hypocritical. People like me aren't even considered citizens of the United States. She does not enjoy Philadelphia. She does not. The backlash that she and her family faces is pretty intense in multiple ways. And so here is the earliest known image of Charlotte Forten. This was taken in the 1860s in the studio of Charles Spieler. This has only been known about for a couple of years now, this portrait, because it was recently donated to the Library Company of Philadelphia by a descendant of her mother, by a descendant of Charlotte L. Forten's mother, Mary Virginia Wood Forten. And this album that this photograph is part of had been passed down through 6 generations of the Wood Webb family, which is connected to Charlotte L. Forten's mother, Mary. And it's now kind of part of the knowledge of the photographic representations of the Forten family. Really wonderful portrait of her as a young woman, but this is her a little bit later in life. when she is photographed here in Washington, D.C., when she moves here after the Civil War, gets married to Francis J. Grimke, a Presbyterian minister, a multiracial man who would go on to be one of the founders of the NAACP. There's multiple photographic portraits of Charlotte L. Forten. These were done by Charles Milton Bell, a photographer here in Washington, D.C. You can see this one. This is actually in that same album that was donated to the Library Company of Philadelphia. That's Charlotte with her only daughter, who unfortunately died in her first year of life. This is the only photograph of Theodora Grimke, but in that family album. Yeah, it's sad to see this and know what happened to Theodora, dying from sickness in her infancy, but it's still something that the family kept and placed in that album. This is Charles Milton Bell here. This is another wonderful photograph of Charlotte L. Forten, now Charlotte Forten Grimke, after her marriage. She's a longtime educator, part of the free Black elite here in Washington, D.C. after the Civil War. And one of her cousins, Harriet Purvis, this is a daughter of Robert and Harriet Davy Forten Purvis, is also prominent in the Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. circles. Harriet, this is her as a young woman, photographed by Frederick Goodekunst in Philadelphia. Is the back of the photograph. She quickly befriended Susan B. Anthony, actually, and would travel with her and was quite involved in the women's suffrage movement. For example, in 1899, Harriet Purvis traveled across the Atlantic with Susan B. Anthony for the International Conference on Women, International Women's Conference, to talk about women's rights beyond the United States and the United Kingdom. So she's a representative for the United States at that convention. Her brother, Charles Burley Purvis, also prominent here in Washington, D.C. This is the only surviving photograph of him when he's a prominent doctor here in the city. He's one of the founders of Howard University's medical school. Charles Burley Purvis had been photographed in Philadelphia earlier in life. When you look at the Goodekunst photography ledgers, you see his name pop up. But just to give you a sense of the physical spaces in which these photographs are being taken in Philadelphia, this just gives you a labeling of where the Forten home was, where the Purvis home was in the city, in relation to Independence Hall at the center of the screen there. These are the studios where they're going to be photographed. 75% of Philadelphia's Black community in the early 19th century lived roughly around where the stars of the Purvis and Forten homes were. That was the Black community, Black neighborhood in Philadelphia at the time. So they're leaving that neighborhood to go up to the kind of the core of Philadelphia. And I think it took confidence to go into those studios. It took some courage because of the backlash that they're facing in Philadelphia for their reform-minded efforts, their abolitionist efforts. But the Forten family deserves more recognition, and I hope that these photographs can help us visualize this family better. And this project was all part of reassembling their material world, which comes out in the exhibit that's on display at the Museum of the American Revolution. So thank you very much for your attention today. There is, yeah. You could, if you can't make it to Philadelphia before November 26th, there's a virtual tour of the exhibit freely accessible on the museum's website. You'll see many of these portraits in there, either recreated on the wall or the actual physical ones. All right, thanks.